In a small rural town nestled among gently rolling hills and golden wheat fields, where the wind whispered ancient secrets through ripened stalks, Jonathan was born and raised. In a modest wooden house whose old planks creaked with the passing of the seasons, he discovered the meaning of love in the calloused hands of his mother, Mary, a woman of calm demeanor and deep gaze, who carried on her shoulders the weight of a life of sacrifice, and in her heart, the lightness of one who knows the true value of simple things. Mornings began with the aroma of homemade bread Mary prepared in her old wood-fired oven. Her fingers, marked by time and hard work, kneaded flour with water and salt, transforming humble ingredients into nourishment that fed not just the body, but also the soul. Jonathan would watch that daily ritual with curious eyes, without fully understanding that those gestures contained lessons more valuable than any material treasure. "My son," Mary would say as they shared breakfast at the worn wooden table, "never forget that the worth of a person does not lie in what they own, but in what they carry in their heart." Her words resonated through the modest room, blending with the sound of birds singing beyond the window and the distant murmur of farmers already beginning their daily toil. As he grew, Jonathan helped his mother with household chores and on the small patch of land where they planted vegetables. Sweat dripped down his young brow as he pulled weeds beneath the relentless sun. By his side, Mary taught him about the earth's mysteries, the seasons best for each crop, the patience needed to harvest at just the right time. "Life is like this garden, my son," she would say serenely. "It requires constant care, patience, and faith to endure the storms." On winter nights, when the biting cold seeped through the cracks of the house and the fireplace crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls, Mary told old stories. She spoke of men who traded true happiness for passing illusions, of kings who, despite being surrounded by riches, died lonely, and of humble farmers who found priceless treasures in the simplicity of their lives. Jonathan listened closely, wrapped in a patched blanket, his eyes shining with the firelight as his imagination soared beyond the hills that framed his horizon. Over the years, something began to change in Jonathan's heart. Tales from travelers who occasionally passed through the town spoke of distant cities, where people lived in large houses of stone, dressed in fine clothes, and could buy whatever they desired. Those accounts planted a seed of restlessness within him, a seed that gradually grew into ambition and discontent. By the time he reached adulthood, Jonathan could no longer see beauty in the simplicity around him. The fields, once shimmering gold, now seemed like nothing more than barren dirt. The home where he had grown up, once a cozy refuge, was only a ramshackle house highlighting his poverty. And Mary, with her worn clothes and rough hands, came to symbolize the life he so desperately wished to leave behind. It was on a gray afternoon, when heavy clouds warned of an imminent storm, that Jonathan finally revealed his plans to his mother. "I'm going to the city, Mom. I can't live like this anymore, stuck in a life with no prospects. I want more. I deserve more." His words fell harshly, like stones tossed into a still pond, shattering the serenity that had existed between them. Mary did not cry as he expected. Her eyes, hardened by time, remained steady, though a shadow of hurt momentarily darkened them. "If that's what your heart desires, my son, I won't stand in your way. But remember, when the world out there feels too big, this door will always be open for you." She then handed him a small bundle of provisions for the journey and a leather pouch containing the few dollars she had saved over the years. Jonathan left amid the gathering rain, leaving footprints that the storm soon washed away. He did not turn back to see his mother standing in the doorway, nor did he witness the tears that finally rolled down her lined face, mixing with the merciless rain. His heart was too consumed by dreams of wealth and glory to feel the weight of their farewell. The journey to the city was grueling. Days of walking along muddy roads, nights spent in barns or beneath trees for shelter. But when he finally saw the rooftops and towers rising majestically against the blue sky, Jonathan felt that every hardship had been worth it. The city was everything the travelers had described, and more. It was a world of possibilities, a swirl of colors and sounds that initially overwhelmed him. Using the money his mother had given him, he rented a small room in a boarding house on the outskirts of town. For the first few days, he wandered the streets admiring bright store windows, sleek cars passing by, and well-dressed people walking with purpose. It all moved at a frenetic pace, so unlike the slow, predictable rhythm of his hometown. Before long, Jonathan found work as an assistant in a high-end fabric store. The owner, Mr. Anderson, an observant man in midlife, recognized the young rural newcomer's potential. He was strong, hardworking, and above all, hungry for success. "I can see it in your eyes, kid," the merchant said, showing him the different fabrics and explaining their worth. "That drive to climb your way up, that's good. It's what gets you to the top." Jonathan soaked up each lesson eagerly. He learned how to spot quality materials, negotiate with suppliers, and charm wealthy clients. He studied how successful businessmen dressed, spoke, and carried themselves. At night, alone in his cramped room, he practiced in front of a cracked mirror the gestures and expressions he had memorized. Months turned into years. Jonathan's determination, coupled with his natural intelligence and ability to learn, led him to advance quickly. Impressed by his skills, Mr. Anderson promoted him to store manager. His simple clothing was replaced by sophisticated suits. His rustic accent grew more refined. His manners became polished. On the outside, he seemed like a completely different man. Inside, an even deeper transformation took place. Jonathan began to move in high society circles, invited by wealthy clients who enjoyed his company and business acumen. At fancy dinners and lavish parties, he carried himself with a studied poise, as though he had always belonged in that world. If anyone asked about his origins, he lied without hesitation. "I come from a family of northern merchants. My parents died when I was young, leaving me a small inheritance that I invested wisely." Repeated so often, the lie started to sound like truth in his own ears. The image of Mary, with her simple dress and calloused hands, was relegated to the darkest corners of his memory, an uncomfortable ghost of a past he preferred to forget. During one of those social events, Jonathan met Elizabeth, the only daughter of one of the city's most influential men. She embodied refined beauty, hair as dark as midnight, skin as fair as porcelain, and striking green eyes. Her lilting laughter and her intellect captivated Jonathan immediately. More than that, her family name and fortune were the final key to the social ascent he had always dreamed of. They began seeing each other often, always in elegant settings. Jonathan spent a considerable portion of his earnings on expensive gifts and exclusive restaurants, determined to win the heart of this wealthy young woman. Though Elizabeth seemed genuinely taken with him, her father, Mr. Richardson, an astute businessman, was quietly suspicious. "There's something about you, young man, that I can't quite figure out," he said once with a smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "It's as though you're always playing a role." Those words unsettled Jonathan deeply, but he brushed them aside, convinced that in time he would prove himself worthy of full acceptance into that privileged circle. His relationship with Elizabeth flourished, and less than a year later, they announced their engagement. The news was celebrated with an extravagant party at Mr. Richardson's mansion, drawing the city's elite. Among crystal glasses, orchestral music, and refined conversation, Jonathan finally felt victorious. Surveying the luxury around him and the beautiful fiancée at his side, he believed he had attained everything he had ever wanted. Yet a vague restlessness clung to his heart, like a small stone in one's shoe, impossible to ignore completely. That very night, slipping away briefly from the guests to get some air in the mansion's lush garden, Jonathan had an encounter that would alter the course of his life. Sitting on a stone bench partly concealed by flowering vines was an older man who looked entirely out of place in such opulence. Though his clothes were clean, they were modest. His deeply lined face radiated a quiet serenity, standing in stark contrast to the evening's bustle. "It's a pleasant night, isn't it, Jonathan?" The man's voice was calm and melodic, as if it reached beyond mere appearances. Surprised that a stranger knew his name, Jonathan replied warily, "Yes, it is. Are you related to my fiancé's family?" The old man smiled, the expression lighting up his entire face. "No, I'm not related to anyone here. My name is Eli. Let's just say I'm an observer of life, a bearer of memories people sometimes prefer to forget." There was something in Eli's gaze that unsettled Jonathan, as if those eyes could see past the careful layers of his new identity. "I don't understand what you mean." Eli stood slowly, leaning on a polished wooden cane. "Come, walk with me a bit. This garden is quite beautiful, don't you think? A little like the fields around your hometown, though more manicured." Jonathan's heart raced. How could this stranger know about his real origins? "I think you're confusing me with someone else. I was born up north in a family of merchants," Eli interrupted gently. "No, Jonathan. You were born among the green hills, son of Mary, a woman with calloused hands and a generous heart, who still looks out her small window every day, hoping to see the silhouette of the son who left her behind." A tremor coursed through Jonathan. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as though he were suddenly laid bare before all the party's guests. "Who are you? How do you know these things?" "I already told you. I'm a messenger." Eli reached out and touched Jonathan's shoulder. The contact sent a strange warmth coursing through him. "I've come to deliver a message, a lesson you need to learn before it's too late." "I don't need lessons from a stranger," Jonathan snapped, trying to regain composure. "Especially not tonight at my own engagement party." "That is precisely why I came tonight," Eli said, his eyes shining with an ancient wisdom. "You're on the verge of building your life on shaky ground, on a foundation of denial about who you really are." Jonathan tried to withdraw, to hurry back to the safety of the party, away from this old man and his unsettling words. But his feet seemed glued to the garden's pathway. Eli's voice grew deeper. "The shame you feel about your background is like a slow poison, Jonathan. It's corroding your soul day by day, pushing you away from the only person who ever loved you unconditionally. You're trading what's real for what's fake, the timeless for the fleeting." "You don't understand," Jonathan retorted, his voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "I had to leave that life behind. There was no future for me there, only hardship and limitations." "And have you found happiness here, in all this luxury and pretense?" Eli asked, gesturing toward the brightly lit mansion. "Is your heart truly at peace? Or is there a growing emptiness no amount of wealth can fill?" His words struck Jonathan like arrows hitting their mark. The emptiness Eli spoke of was all too real, a constant presence he tried to ignore, filling his days with relentless work and his nights with expensive distractions. "What do you want from me, anyway?" "I want you to remember, Jonathan. Remember who you really are, the love that shaped your early years, the lessons learned at your mother's simple table." Eli stepped closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "True greatness is not found by denying your roots, but by honoring them. It doesn't come from accumulating possessions, but by cultivating virtues. It's not about being admired by strangers, but being loved by those who know your heart." A sudden memory flooded Jonathan's mind. His mother kneeling in their small garden, teaching him how to plant seeds, explaining that each one contained a miracle, an infinite potential that only needed care and time to come forth. "Just like these seeds, my son," she would say. "You too carry infinite possibilities inside. The important thing is to grow toward the light, no matter how deep the darkness around you." That recollection, so vivid it might have been happening in that very moment, brought tears to Jonathan's eyes. He tried to hold them back, but one tear escaped, tracing a path down his clean-shaven face. "It's too late," he murmured, more to himself than to Eli. "I've built my entire life here. I can't just leave everything behind." "I'm not asking you to abandon anything, only to live in truth," Eli replied. "Truth sets you free, Jonathan. No matter how pretty a lie may seem, it's always a prison." Music and laughter floated over from the party, a reminder to Jonathan of the life he had created, of the fiancée waiting for him, of the future he'd planned. "I need to get back," he said, hastily wiping away his solitary tear. Eli nodded. "Understanding. Go. But take my words with you and know that this won't be our last conversation." Jonathan felt a soft breeze brush his face as he turned to head back to the mansion. Looking back over his shoulder to bid Eli farewell, he found the bench empty. The old man was gone. Jonathan glanced around the moonlit garden, but saw no sign of him. It was as though he had vanished into the night, or perhaps he had never truly been there at all. Shaken, Jonathan returned to the celebration, but something had changed. The smiles around him appeared hollow. The polished conversation seemed shallow. Noticing his distant expression, Elizabeth asked if he was all right. "I'm just tired," he replied automatically, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. That night, in his luxurious apartment, Jonathan couldn't sleep. Eli's words played over and over in his mind, mingling with long-suppressed memories. The aroma of Mary's homemade bread, the sound of her laughter when they worked together in the garden, and the safety he'd felt falling asleep under her watchful care. Images of his simple yet loving childhood contrasted painfully with the loneliness he now experienced, even surrounded by comfort and admiration. The following days were sheer torment. Jonathan tried to focus on the wedding plans, the business, and his social life, but the unrest in his chest grew larger by the hour. Eli's warning about building a life on unstable ground felt more accurate each passing day. One afternoon, as he was reviewing documents in his office at the store, a delivery man walked in carrying a package. "A delivery for you," said the man, placing the bundle on the desk. Before Jonathan could thank him or ask who had sent it, the man was gone. Curious, Jonathan opened the package. Inside was a small loaf of homemade bread, still warm, exuding an aroma that instantly transported him back to his childhood kitchen. Alongside the bread lay a note in graceful handwriting. "Certain hungers can't be satisfied by banquets. Eli." Jonathan's hands shook as he picked up the bread. He brought it to his nose, breathing in the scent that unleashed a torrent of memories. Without thinking, he tore off a piece and tasted it. The flavor, so simple and yet so comforting, sent a wave of emotion through him that he could not hold. Alone in his refined office, Jonathan wept as he had not wept since he was a child. That afternoon marked the beginning of a profound inner journey. Jonathan questioned every aspect of the life he had built for himself. His relationship with Elizabeth, partially founded on lies. His career, though successful, rooted in denying his past, and his apparent happiness, which he now recognized as a carefully maintained facade. Over the next few days, Jonathan searched the city for Eli. He visited parks, churches, markets, asking everyone about an older man with wise eyes and a polished wooden cane. No one seemed to know him. It was as though the old man had been nothing more than an apparition, a messenger sent from somewhere else to awaken him from his illusory dream. During one of those searches, Jonathan found himself standing before the city's old church. Moved by an impulse he couldn't explain, he went inside. Cool and silent, the interior was illuminated by beams of colored light streaming through the stained glass windows. He sat down on one of the empty pews, letting the hush enfold him. There, under the grand vaulted ceiling, Jonathan finally understood the emptiness that haunted him. It sprang not merely from lacking authenticity in his new life, but from the absence of the unconditional love he had once known. A love that did not require fancy attire or wealth, was not impressed by appearances or possessions, but simply existed, constant as the sunrise, enduring even when undeserved. In a moment of absolute clarity, Jonathan realized what he had to do. Rising from the pew, he left the church, feeling strangely light as he walked away. The next morning, he asked Elizabeth for a private conversation. In the very garden where he had once encountered Eli, Jonathan confessed the truth about his background. He told her of the small wooden house among the hills, of the mother he had abandoned, of his shame in her simplicity. "I'll understand if you want to break off our engagement," he concluded, not daring to meet her gaze. "I built our relationship on lies, and you deserve better." To his surprise, Elizabeth showed neither anger nor disappointment. She gently touched his face, guiding him to look into her eyes. "Jonathan, what made me love you had nothing to do with your supposed birth or wealth. It was the kindness I see in you, no matter how hard you try to hide it." Her green eyes, glimmered with sincerity. "But you're right about one thing. We can't build our future on lies. You need to make peace with your past before we can truly move forward." Elizabeth's words, both compassionate and resolute, reinforced what Jonathan had already decided. He had to return to his hometown, confront the abandonment he had inflicted on his mother, and seek forgiveness for ever being ashamed of her and all she represented. In the following days, Jonathan arranged his affairs for an extended absence. Mr. Anderson, though startled to learn his true background, was sympathetic. "I always suspected there was more to your story, kid," said the merchant. "Go on, do what you have to do. Your place will be here when you get back." Traveling back to the small rural town was very different from the journey he had made years before. This time he traveled in comfort, but his heart weighed heavily. With each mile that brought him closer to home, his anxiety grew. How would his mother receive him? Could she forgive years of silence and neglect? What if she had fallen ill, or worse? Finally glimpsing the familiar hills, Jonathan was overwhelmed with emotion. The town looked smaller than he remembered, and simpler, yet oddly more vibrant. The colors appeared more intense, the air fresher, the sky bluer. It was as though he were seeing everything for the first time, or seeing it all with new eyes. The rented car drew curious glances from neighbors. He recognized a few older faces lined by the passage of time, as well as some new ones. No one seemed to recognize him as the once ragged boy who had left so long ago. Heart-pounding, Jonathan walked the dusty road leading to his childhood home. Even from a distance, he saw that little had changed. The roof still had a few missing shingles. The fence around the small garden still leaned to one side, and a thin spiral of smoke from the chimney revealed that someone inside was cooking. Stopped at the door, momentarily paralyzed by fear and hope. Then, summoning all his courage, he knocked 3 times, just as he had done when returning from school so many years ago. Time seemed to stretch as he waited. Finally, the door opened slowly, revealing a figure smaller than he remembered, stooped by the years, yet with the same piercing eyes that seemed capable of seeing his soul. "Mom," he breathed the word out like a sigh. Mary stood motionless. For an instant, her eyes roaming her son's face, recognizing him beneath the changes wrought by city life. Then, without a word, she held out her arms. Jonathan fell into that embrace as a castaway clings to a life raft. Her familiar scent, a comforting mix of herbs, bread, and love, enveloped him completely. The tears he had held back for so long flowed freely, dampening the shoulder of her simple dress. "Forgive me, Mom," he sobbed, the words nearly lost in his choking cries. "Forgive me for ever being ashamed of you, of our home, of our life." Mary drew back slightly, just enough to look into his eyes. Her own eyes shimmered with tears, yet they shone with an infinite understanding. "There's nothing to forgive, my son. You had to follow your path, to discover for yourself what truly matters in life." "How can you say that?" Jonathan asked, dumbfounded by such boundless kindness. "I left you behind, denied our roots, felt ashamed of your love." Mary's smile was filled with a world's worth of wisdom. "Real love doesn't keep track of wrongs, my son. It simply waits, patient as the seasons." She took his hands in hers, noticing how different they were. Softer, nails well-groomed, yet still recognizing the boy she had raised. "Besides, I was never truly alone." She led him inside. The house looked much as Jonathan remembered. Plain, neat, welcoming. The same wooden table occupied the small kitchen, covered by a worn embroidered cloth. And sitting at that table, sipping tea from a chipped cup, was Eli. "You!" Jonathan exclaimed in amazement. The old man smiled serenely. "Welcome back, Jonathan, or should I say, welcome home." Mary glanced from one to the other, puzzled. "You two know each other?" "In a manner of speaking," Eli answered, rising to his feet. "Let's just say we met in a garden one night, at a time when Jonathan needed to be reminded of some essential truths." That afternoon, the 3 of them talked at length around the kitchen table. Jonathan recounted his life in the city, telling Mary about Elizabeth, about the store. This time with total honesty, no longer hiding his past, no longer ashamed of his origins. acknowledging how her lessons had, in fact, helped him succeed. Mary, in turn, spoke about the years of his absence, how she never stopped gazing out the window awaiting his return, how she kept his room just as he had left it. "Faith is like that, son," she said simply. "It believes even when the eyes cannot see." Eli mostly listened in silence, observing mother and son with kind eyes. When evening fell and Mary went to prepare dinner, Jonathan finally asked the question that had been burning inside him. "Who are you really, Eli? How did you know where to find me? How do you know my mother?" The old man smiled, his eyes reflecting the lamplight. "There are many mysteries in this world, Jonathan, things beyond what our limited minds can understand. Let's just say, I'm someone sent to help those who have lost their way to find it again." "An angel?" Jonathan asked, half serious and half teasing. Eli laughed, a surprisingly lighthearted sound. "Labels are just limited ways of explaining what lies beyond our grasp. The important thing isn't who I am, but the message I bring." Before Jonathan could press further, Mary returned with a steaming pot of stew, the same dish she used to cook on cold nights when he was a boy. Its familiar aroma triggered a flood of memories, reminding him of how deeply his identity was rooted in this humble place. During dinner, Jonathan watched his mother with new eyes. The wrinkles marking her face were not signs of weakness or poverty, as he had once believed, but the record of a life of strength and sacrifice. Each line told a story of love, selflessness, and quiet wisdom. How could he have felt ashamed of this face that had only ever shown him love? "Tomorrow, I'd like to visit the fields where we used to plant together," Jonathan said, surprised by his own desire. "I want to feel the soil under my feet again, to remember what it's like to work with my hands." Mary smiled, eyes shining with emotion. "The garden is still there, waiting for you. Some of the fruit trees we planted have been bearing abundant crops. Like the seeds of virtue you sowed in your heart," Eli added gently. "They're finally beginning to blossom, after enduring the long winter of denial." Later that evening, Jonathan insisted on washing the dishes, an ordinary task made almost sacred by the meaning it now held. His hands, softened by years of relatively easy city work, immersed themselves in the warm water. He felt the worn dishes, the same ones that had held so many meals in his childhood. When it was time for bed, Jonathan returned to his old room. Just as Mary had said, it had been preserved like a sanctuary awaiting his return. The narrow bed, the patched blanket, the childhood drawings still taped to the walls, all tangible fragments of an identity he had tried to discard, but now recognized as an essential part of himself. Lying in the darkness, listening to the familiar, nighttime sounds of the country, the distant croaking of frogs by a stream, the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, Jonathan experienced a peace he had not felt in years. The emptiness that had tormented him in the city, even amid luxury, was steadily being filled by the mere act of reconnecting with his roots. At dawn, he woke to the crowing of roosters and the scent of fresh coffee. He found Mary in the kitchen, already bustling with morning activities. Eli, however, had gone. "He left before sunrise," Mary explained, noticing Jonathan's unspoken question. "He said his work here was done." Without saying goodbye, Jonathan felt a twinge of disappointment. Mary smiled knowingly. "People like Eli rarely say real goodbyes. They remain with us through the seeds they've planted in our hearts." After breakfast, mother and son walked together through the fields. Spring had arrived, bringing the promise of renewal. Wildflowers dotted the green slopes, and small shoots poked through the freshly tilled earth. "For all these years," Mary said as they strolled side by side, "I sometimes wondered if I'd failed as a mother. If something about the way I raised you made you ashamed of our life." "No, Mom," Jonathan replied earnestly, feeling the guilt she'd carried in silence. "I was the one who failed. You gave me everything that truly matters. Love, values, strong roots. I was the one who didn't appreciate those priceless gifts." They reached the small orchard they had once planted together. Back then they were just tiny saplings, but now the trees stood tall, covered in blossoms promising a bountiful harvest in the summer. "Look at them, my son," Mary said, sweeping her arm toward the trees. That's how life is. What we plant with love, no matter how small it seems at the time, eventually grows and bears fruit in ways we never imagined. In that moment, seeing the tangible result of seeds planted in the past, Jonathan finally absorbed the lesson Eli had delivered. True wealth wasn't found in the possessions he had accumulated, or in the status he had chased, but in the values and love he had received growing up in that humble setting. The next few days fell into a gentle pattern of reconnection. Jonathan worked around the house, had long talks with Mary at mealtimes, and relearned the rhythms of rural life. Each day, he felt the layers of the false identity he had built peeling away, revealing the man he truly was, a man shaped by the simple but profound love of a devoted mother. Nights were spent on the porch of the small house under a starry sky. Mary recounted stories of the neighbors, of joys and sorrows that had filled the years of Jonathan's absence. He listened intently, recognizing how much he had missed by leaving behind a life he once dismissed as insignificant. A week into his stay, a letter arrived from Elizabeth. With trembling hands, he opened the perfumed envelope. "My dear Jonathan," it read in elegant handwriting, "I hope you found what you were searching for in your return to your roots. I miss you, but I understand the importance of this journey. When you're ready, I'll be here, eager to meet your mother and the place that shaped you. With love, Elizabeth." Her words touched him deeply. Elizabeth's acceptance, her desire to know his true origins, was an unexpected gift. He had feared she might break off their engagement after learning about his humble past, but instead, she had shown an empathy that only strengthened his love for her. That evening, Jonathan spoke at length with his mother about the future. "I need to go back to the city, Mom. I have responsibilities there, people who rely on me. And there's Elizabeth." Mary nodded with understanding. "I know you can't stay here forever, my son. Your life is there now. I just hope you won't forget again who you really are." "Never again," Jonathan promised fervently. "I want you to come with me. I can't bear the thought of leaving you alone again." Mary's eyes widened with surprise. "Go to the city? Oh no, my son. My place is right here in these hills, taking care of this patch of land that's fed our family for generations. What if I buy a house on the outskirts? Some land so you can have your garden, your flowers. We'd see each other often and you wouldn't be alone." Mary fell silent for a moment, considering. "Let's do this instead," she finally said. "You go live your life in the city with your fiancé and your work. I'll stay here where I belong. But promise you'll come visit me regularly, and that you'll never again feel ashamed of your background." "I promise," Jonathan said, holding her worn hands in his own. "And I promise that Elizabeth and I will build a country home, here near you, so we can spend time close to you. I want our future children to grow up learning your wisdom, just as I did." Tears filled Mary's eyes at the thought of grandchildren running through the same fields where her son had once played. "That would make me very happy, my boy." On the eve of his departure, Jonathan sat down at the kitchen table and wrote a long letter to Mr. Richardson, Elizabeth's father. In it, he laid bare his true past, his remorse for having concealed it, and his commitment to building a future based on truth. "I am not the son of wealthy merchants," he wrote, "but of a woman whose love and wisdom far exceed any fortune. If that makes me unworthy of your daughter's hand in your eyes, I'll respect your decision. But know that regardless of social standing or material wealth, I will love Elizabeth with the same steadfastness and devotion my mother has shown me my entire life." On the morning of his departure, Mary prepared Jonathan's favorite breakfast and packed him provisions for the road, just as she had done years before. But this time the farewell was not marred by shame or a need to escape. It was marked by mature love and a commitment to keep their family bond alive. "Take this with you," Mary said, handing him a small parcel. Inside, Jonathan found a piece of embroidered cloth cut from his childhood blanket. "So you'll always remember where you came from, even when you're far away." Tears prickling his eyes, Jonathan embraced his mother, feeling in that moment all the strength and love that had shaped his life. "I'll be back soon," he promised, "and I'll bring Elizabeth to meet you." As he drove off, he looked in the rearview mirror to see his mother's figure in the doorway of the small house. This time, he did not feel shame in his heart, but gratitude and a renewed love. The divine lesson imparted by Eli had sunk in completely. True greatness is not in denying your origins, but in honoring them, not in accumulating belongings, but in cultivating virtues, not in being admired by strangers, but in being loved by those who truly know your heart. Back in the city, Jonathan found Elizabeth waiting for him, radiant with anticipation. Seeing her, he realized his love for her had only deepened during their time apart, transforming into something more genuine, more mature. He told her everything about reconciling with his mother, about the lessons learned, about the mysterious Eli. "I want to meet your mother as soon as possible," Elizabeth said, sincerity shining in her eyes. "I want to learn from her, to better understand the man I love." Mr. Richardson, to Jonathan's surprise, replied to his letter with a brief but supportive note. "Honesty is the foundation of any lasting relationship, be it in business or family. Your belated yet brave candor speaks louder about your character than any lineage could. My daughter has chosen well." In the months that followed, Jonathan underwent a profound transformation in every area of his life. In business, he abandoned questionable practices in favor of unwavering ethics, even if it meant smaller profits. In his social sphere, he cast aside pretenses and cultivated friendships based on sincerity and shared values. With Elizabeth, he built genuine intimacy, grounded in vulnerability and truth. True to his promise, Jonathan took Elizabeth to meet Mary. The encounter between the two most important women in his life was marked by immediate kinship. Elizabeth, raised amid sophistication and privilege, was genuinely fascinated by Mary's simple wisdom, her knowledge of herbs and plants, and her stories brimming with life lessons. They married in the fall, a celebration that merged the refinement of the city's high society with the authenticity of rural life. At Jonathan's request, the ceremony took place in his hometown, beneath a canopy of autumn leaves, with Mary seated at the place of honor. Initially reluctant to attend such a remote event, Mr. Richardson soon found himself charmed by the genuine warmth and hospitality of the townspeople. As promised, Jonathan and Elizabeth built a country house near Mary's home. On weekends and holidays, they would escape the city's hustle to enjoy the peace and honesty of rural living. There, surrounded by the land and the family roots, they recharged for the challenges of urban life. A year after the wedding, Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Elisa, in tribute to the mysterious messenger who had changed Jonathan's life. Now a grandmother, Mary passed on to her granddaughter the same lessons she had once bestowed upon her son, weaving a bond between generations, a link of unwavering love and enduring values. When little Elisa turned 3, on a particularly beautiful spring afternoon, the family was having a picnic in the rolling hills. Jonathan watched his mother teaching her granddaughter how to identify wildflowers, just as she had once taught him. Elizabeth, seated beside him under the shade of a blossoming apple tree, rested her head on his shoulder. "Are you happy?" she asked softly. Jonathan gazed upon the scene, his mother and daughter kneeling in the green grass, visibly connected by love. The gently sloping hills he had once dismissed as inadequate, now a paradise of simple beauty. The endless sky above them, silent witness to his life's journey. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he answered truthfully. "I've realized that true wealth was always here, waiting for me to be wise enough to see it." At that moment, he caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of his eye. Turning, he saw the familiar figure of an old man with a wooden cane watching from a distance. Eli smiled and raised a hand in a faint wave before turning away and gradually disappearing into the landscape. Jonathan did not chase him this time. He understood that the lesson was complete and the cycle closed. The shame he had once felt for his humble origins had evolved into profound gratitude. The contempt for simplicity had transformed into recognition of its innate beauty. His empty ambition had been replaced by an authentic purpose. There, surrounded by the people he loved, beneath the same sky that had watched him leave years before, Jonathan finally grasped the divine lesson. In its purest essence, Life is not measured by the possessions we amass or the status we achieve, but by our capacity to love and be loved authentically, to honor our roots, and to cultivate virtues that transcend the fleeting sparkle of the material world.